The newsagents.
It's as if I told you that you would cut the Mona Lisa in half, and you would have half of it at the Louvre and half of it at the British Museum. Do you think your viewers would appreciate the beauty of the painting in such a way? Well, this is exactly what happened with the Parthenon.
That was Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and he's the Greek Prime Minister. He was speaking on the BBC Sunday show just 2 days ago, a little clip really that went almost unnoticed until suddenly, 48 hours later, it's blown up into the weirdest diplomatic row anyone can really remember.
Mitsotakis was due to be meeting Rishi Sunak as part of a 3-day visit. Downing Street, late last night, told journalists that visit was off, having been apparently disappointed that Mitsotakis had brought up the Parthenon Sculptures in an interview on the BBC. There is almost no precedent for a head of government in London due to meet the Prime Minister to be cancelled, to be spurned so readily, so comprehensively. On today's show, we're going to be talking to you about why this has happened.
Welcome to the newsagents.
The newsagents.
It's Emily.
And it's Lewis. Can we just, before Emily we start, we're going to make it very clear, we're not going to talk about Rishi Sunak losing his marbles at any point today.
Such a great title
Such a great
from John
gag.
Sopel, our Baden correspondent.
Yeah, cheers, John. Thanks for nothing for that particular contribution this morning. Anyway, right, so this is about the Elgin Marbles or the Parthenon Sculptures, depending on which side of this particular fence that you sit on. And just in case you don't know about them, you've never seen them, you don't care about them, which, as we're going to discuss, is probably most of the British public. This is a collection of sculptures which have been in British hands for about 200 years or so. 17 sculptures, they're 2,500 years old. They were part of a frieze that decorated the ancient Parthenon temple at the Acropolis in Athens. They were taken by Lord Elgin, because his argument was, and the British government view at the time is that they weren't being sort of taken care of very well, that they weren't being looked after, that they were basically, the whole Parthenon was just a complete
sacked,
ruin. It had been sacked, exactly. And they ended up in Britain because the British diplomat, Lord Elgin, removed the sculptures from the Parthenon temple. At the time, he was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, which then ruled Greece. And they were all taken in 170 crates back to the UK and have been here ever since. And ever since, they have basically been a problem for Anglo-Greek relations because Greek governments, particularly in the modern era, have been arguing very, very strongly that they should be returned to Greece because they were taken illegitimately. British governments have resisted that. In recent years, particularly even in the last sort of year or so, there has been quite sustained effort from the British Museum, where they're housed under their now chairman, George Osborne, of course, and the Greek government to arrange a loan agreement which would see the marbles taken back on a loan basis to Greece. And then step into this today, or yesterday, Rishi Sunak, who, as we were saying at the top there, has decided to cancel a meeting with the Greek Prime Minister because the Greek Prime Minister dared to bring up this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you think you know about the Elgin Marbles row, you can slightly put to one side at this point. What we do know is that there has been a move in the last 18 months to try and find a resolution which would involve the kind of sharing or the borrowing or the sort of swapping over of some bits of some artefacts for other bits of other artefacts between Greece and the UK. And what Rishi Sunak's government seems to be saying is that they had a promise from Kyriakos Mitsotakis, from the Greek Prime Minister, that he would not speak publicly about the Parthenon sculptures, that this meeting was a chance for other things. Now, yesterday, Mr. Mitsotakis met Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. And apparently during that meeting, 45 minutes, they talked about immigration, they talked about the Middle East, they talked about the kind of subjects that you would expect two sort of fellow NATO countries to talk about. Now, what we don't know is whether Rishi Sunak was miffed because he met Keir Starmer first, or whether it was because he broke his pledge and made this sort of petition live on BBC TV to try and open conversations about the marbles, the sculptures. From Labour's perspective, they say that they are looking on with amusement. They say that the meeting had been scheduled both with Sunak and with Keir Starmer. The whole visit was to meet the Prime Minister. That was the visit's purpose. And I think there is a sense amongst, some of the Labour front bench right now that here you have Rishi Sunak, who is calling for negotiated political solutions in the Middle East, who's been hands-on trying to talk through the situation with Israel, the situation with Hamas, and yet he can't even meet the Greek Prime Minister. He can't even meet a NATO ally. He cancels a meeting because of something that Sunak would not agree with. And I think there is that sense now of petulance or even a tiny bit of childishness, really, that here is an ally that you've really got to be talking about things with. And Rishi Sunak apparently tried to put Oliver Dowden, his deputy, forward for the meeting because he didn't want to do it, at which point the Greeks walked off.
This whole thing is so weird. Let's take what Downing Street has said at face value, and they've reaffirmed it at the lobby briefing today with political journalists, that they had an agreement from the Greeks that they weren't going to talk about the Parthenon Sculptures. Well, first of all, Mitsotakis was asked about it in the BBC interview. It would be kind of weird if he didn't say anything about it at all. OK, he described it in pretty graphic terms, talking about the Mona Lisa and so on, but leaving that to one side. It is so weird to expect a Greek Prime Minister not to mention it in some form when visiting London. I mean, it would be like expecting the Spanish not to talk about Gibraltar, or it might be expecting the Argentinian president not to talk about the Falklands. This is kind of how diplomacy works. Things are brought up. It's a bit like the equivalent of when it's always expected that British prime ministers or whatever will go, say if they're going to China or wherever, or somewhere with poor human rights record. They have to mention human rights. No one really expects anything to happen as a result of it, but they have to mention it just so they can say, when asked about it later, for domestic political considerations, and by the way, we don't care much about these marbles in Britain, the British public that is, but the Greek public actually does. It is a big political issue within Greece, particularly with regards to Anglo-Greek relations. Then he has to be seen to say it. It would be really odd if he didn't.
Well, OK, I've heard from Downing Street who say that there was an agreement, as they understand it, there was an agreement that the Greeks would not mention it. And I guess this really takes you to why it was so important that it wasn't mentioned. I mean, on the one hand, you can just go, Rishi Sunak kind of lost his rag because actually the Greeks have backtracked on a promise they made. And if you're coming to do diplomacy, then don't break a promise that you've made, if that's what they had understood of it. But I guess the wider question is, why is this such a touchy subject for Rishi Sunak? Why is there so much resting on it? And I'm not trying to be flippant here, but particularly given that things have gone missing, as we now know, from the British Museum over the last 20 years without anyone seemingly noticing from their own vaults. So the idea that he is sort of hinging his electoral strength or political strength around retaining these friezes must be speaking to something far deeper, which is about UK identity, British identity, or Britain's standing in the world. I was speaking to another backbencher, actually, a Conservative backbencher, who just said it was bizarre. Cannot understand why you'd cancel a meeting over marbles. If that is the case, and this person left open the possibility that maybe there's something more to this that we don't know about. Maybe there is, something going on beneath the waters that we will only find out about in 48 hours. That's, of course, possible. If there isn't, and you are wasting opportunities to discuss migration and more, then to Rishi Sunak's own backbenchers, this is seeming really odd.
Except that there is not much of the British public that cares about these artefacts. Insofar as there is, they exist among a certain type of cultural conservative on the Tory backbenches and in the wider kind of cultural right. These marbles have become wound up in the kind of wider cultural debate around the repatriation of artefacts and treasures that in some way were taken, plundered, whatever word you want to use, during the British Empire, and which now, instead of basically a reasonably sophisticated conversation going on about that, it has become a kind of almost article of faith for some on the cultural right that these things never leave, that to do so would in some way be an insult to British history, or to say that Britain did something wrong in taking them in the first place. And so that is why, Emily, I think in answer to your question about why they've suddenly become important, it's because they've become emblematic of that wider debate. But I mean, the thing is, look, whichever way you look at this isn't great for Sunak, because either, unless there is a wider thing which we don't know about, which of course we could return to, but let's assume there's not, either he's done this because genuinely it's a fit of pique. That is bad, because ultimately the Greeks are a central ally for us. They're in NATO, they're an EU member. I can't quite think what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean right now that we kind of need the Greeks' help for. Massive migration crisis in Israel, and so on. So we need their help for that. But if it's not, if it is part of, as some people are suggesting, a slightly more considered an attempt to draw a kind of cultural dividing line between himself and Starmer, who they're suggesting would hand back the marbles and whatever, I mean, that is pretty risible, on the basis that really they've got completely lost down the culture war black hole. Because seriously, no one cares. Most of the British electorate do not know what they are, much less care about
they actually
what
think
happens
they're
to them.
marbles. I mean, anyone who thinks...
So if this is your hope to draw a cultural dividing line, good luck to you, because it ain't going to get you nowhere.
Is that Rishi Sunak already has the people who care in his electoral pocket.
But does he? So they're worried about reform, right?
Well, I think he probably does. I mean, if he wants to find the people that he's most likely to lose, they're probably not going to be the people whose first priority is retaining parts of an ancient Greek sculpture, personally. I mean, I think, is he playing to reform? Is he playing to a kind of mythical Farage sort of electorate who care about this stuff? Maybe, but that's an extraordinary rabbit hole down which to then be heading, right?
Yeah.
Because you are not actually dealing with any of your 5 pledges. There is no bigger barnacle than this. You know, if you want to talk about getting your barnacles off the boat, if he's serious about the pledges, they are literally about immigration, stopping the boats, inflation, bringing down the cost of living, NHS crisis. The marbles do not feed into any of those priorities, in which case you're left thinking this is about how you perceive yourself in relation to others on the world stage. And if you're walking away from a meeting, which will have taken, let's be honest, weeks, months to set up, then actually that is more damaging to the interests of this country than anything that giving back the marbles would be doing.
And also just not ideal politically, in the sense that who did meet with him? Keir Starmer. And who's the guy who's looking like the international statesman, the guy meeting foreign leaders? It's Keir Starmer.
Talking about immigration.
Talking about immigration. I mean, if this is a sort of petulant thing, it does speak, as you said, Emily, to a sort of slightly wider sense about Sunak. And there was another story that came out today which sort of is a similar sort of thing, which is that Sunak is apparently, and this happened months ago when Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, Britain's top civil servant, was still in post. I mean, he still technically is in post, but he's off on a leave of absence extended because of illness. But some time ago, apparently he, which would tally with where we are on the electoral cycle, he said to the Prime Minister that I'm going to ask you for permission for officials to start to meet with Labour, their Labour opposition numbers, in preparation for the election. This is a well-established thing that happens before an election, 12 months or so before an election, just so officials can get their heads around what a new government might want to do. It always happens. Sunak has refused permission so far because he doesn't want it to look like there's this sort of government in waiting, fuel an election, or sense that might be happening. So there is that kind of sense of him leaving himself open to the charge of petulance or silliness or pettiness. And I think it's quite dangerous for him as a political personality.
I mean, I think things could definitely be worse because as we speak, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, hasn't yet called Athens a shithole. So
that is true. It's still time. At time of recording, 2:15.
We're going to take you now to the High Court and a libel case that is being brought about by Lawrence Fox. Now, Lawrence Fox is, where do we start? Former actor. He is a political activist. He shot to fame, infamy, notoriety perhaps, with this particular clip on the BBC's Question Time, when a member of the audience was discussing public reaction to Meghan Markle. This is just to jog your memory about the guy we're talking about.
Let's call it by its name. It's racism.
We're the most tolerant, lovely country in Europe. Let's celebrate our women.
What worries me about your comment is you are a white privileged male who has no experience in it.
I mean,
I can't help what I am. I was born like this. It's an immutable characteristic. So to call me a white privileged male is to be racist. You're being racist.
You cannot dismiss. Okay.
So that was the moment that really propelled him into this whole new identity. And at that point, Lawrence Fox, the artist, actor, musician, he'd actually appeared in Lewis, the detective series, kind of died, was gone. And from that point on, he was relaunched as this sort of radicalised. I mean, he admits himself that he watched YouTube videos that radicalised him like some sort of 10-year-old boy. And he became this outspoken warrior, sort of anti-woke warrior, man who was going to put woke in its place. He stood for the London mayor elections. He got 1.9% of the vote. He lost his deposit because anti-woke didn't go down very well in those elections. So that's a little bit of background, Lewis. I think you can fill in the details.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a guy who, he is like one of the sort of strangest evolutions and kind of additions to the kind of spectrum, the cast of weird characters that now sort of populate the kind of culture war of British politics, which unfortunately has become kind of more and more dominant, particularly on the right. I mean, you already said, he said in 2019, he told the Times that he'd been totally radicalised, quotes, against woke culture and political correctness as a result of watching YouTube videos. In June 2022, he tweeted an image of a swastika made from the Progress Pride flag with the caption, "You can openly call the Union flag a symbol of fascism and totalitarianism on Twitter, sick. You cannot criticise the holy flags." That led to him being suspended from Twitter for a day. Just in August this year, he posted a picture of himself on X, formerly Twitter, in blackface, describing himself as now being someone who had, quotes, racially transitioned.
He also burnt trans flags in a garden during Pride Month, his garden. And I think the police came round to see if it was actually a hate crime. And we're not sort of doing all this to sort of big him up or to sort of, make him into this massive sort of counter-hero. We're trying to give you a little bit of the backdrop, which might explain, A, Laurence Fox's deep aversion to any minority support gesture. He really hates gestures like that. And B, it is relevant, we think, to understanding what is going on at the moment in this libel case, because he was called a racist on Twitter by two people. One was the drag artist Crystal and one was the ex-Stonewall trustee Simon Blake and the actress Nicola Thorpe as well. And they called him racist after he said he called for a boycott of Sainsbury's over Sainsbury's celebration of Black History Month back in 2020. So he's saying, why is Sainsbury's doing this? Please everyone boycott Sainsbury's. They come at him and say, you're a racist for saying that. And he retorts that they're paedophiles. But at the moment in the High Court, he is trying to prove that them calling him a racist has led to a massive drop in earnings. It's made it harder for him to get roles, including as Batman, which allegedly was on the cards. And it's made it impossible for him to get a mortgage because his earnings have sunk. So we're just trying to find out how rare this is and what the issues at the heart of this libel case are. Steve Kuncevich is a media and privacy lawyer at Glazers.
Steve, how unusual is a case like this and the particulars of the case?
Well, defamation cases are nothing new. Defamation cases over social media are nothing new. Defamation cases have been going down in number over the course of the last few years. And as we saw with Rena versus Vardy, any number of high-profile cases, the issue with trying to vindicate your reputation in the eyes of the court is that you drag all your dirty laundry out and it kind of vents these allegations all over again. So I think it's rare to see one go to trial. It's particularly rare for a case like this to be tried before a jury, which Laurence Fox tried to arrange for earlier in the case, but that was denied. So it's a high-risk gamble. Defamation cases are, by their very nature, extremely complicated and extremely expensive. I think there's no suggestion that Laurence Fox can't afford to take this case all the way to its final conclusion. But we certainly don't see them that often. We do see them more often over accusations like this over Twitter, unfortunately.
So, Steve, just help me unpick this then. If, and we don't know what the outcome of this case is going to be clearly, but if he loses it, does that mean that the label of racist sticks with him?
Well, it's always very difficult. If you look back at the Johnny Depp case, for example, against Amber Heard, we had a very different result in the US where it was found that she had defamed him. But in the UK, he had a finding of fact by a UK judge that he had beaten his wife. And regardless of what allegations you might make in future, that's a very difficult thing to move away from. You've obviously got to judge each situation by its merits, and any future allegation of racism may be subject to a different defamation claim in and of itself. But if you look back at this set of events and there's a conclusion by a judge of finding a fact that he is a racist, and that obviously is going to be really problematic for him.
It's really high stakes. I mean, he could come out with this, having a court proved exactly the opposite that he went to it for, right?
This is always the issue. You're asking somebody else to make a determination on your reputation, effectively, in this case a judge, and the court of public opinion might have something very different to say about it, but it is very, very difficult to shake this kind of accusation moving forward. Noticeably, Lawrence Fox has claimed that he lost his acting agent, he's lost a number of acting opportunities as a result of this. Whether or not that's going to continue, whether or not he may continue to lose others as a result of a finding of fact by a judge that he can fairly be called a racist, I think remains to be seen.
Do you think that he is hoping that he'll do better from this, whatever happens, is my first question. And B, how do these cases normally end? I mean, is it possible to say whether you think that the judge will find in his favour because of how much is at stake?
We hear reporting about what's going on in court at the minute, and issues that might seem fairly minor to the wider world are going to be poured over in absolutely excessive detail. And the reason that Lawrence Fox is adducing all this evidence about the effects on his life is he wants to show that this has caused him serious harm. That as a direct result of these allegations, he has lost opportunities, it's had an effect on his personal life, all these other things. The argument, I suppose, the other way is that the other parties to the case might not necessarily have suffered as a result of his accusations. So the judge has to play it where it lays, has to deal with it incredibly fairly, has to deal with it on the evidence. And unfortunately, we're not seeing a lot of that evidence apart from what's been reported in the papers.
If the court rules in favour of Fox, would this be any sort of precedent as a judgment? Would it have a sense of being a kind of landmark judgment? Might it affect similar cases in future, or might we see similar sort of people bringing similar sorts of cases?
We've seen similar sorts of cases before. We saw a case involving Katie Hopkins and Jack Monroe. Reported defamation cases are fairly rare. There's actually a very significant one involving James Dyson in court at the moment at the same time. Any time you come to a ruling on the meaning of an allegation, that goes in the back of a legal textbook. This case does involve some fairly novel issues and some fairly important ones. There's no reason why it couldn't potentially set a precedent. But this may be, depending upon the result of the case, we may be ending up in an appeal as well. So it may be quite some time before we get a final idea of how this is all going to play out. I'm not necessarily sure that it ends with the end of this trial.
So fascinating. Steve, thank you so much for laying that out for us. Really interesting.
Thanks, Steve.
No, anytime, guys. Really, really grateful to be on. Thank you.
My own reflections on this, and it is an interesting case, and Fox is in lots of ways, a pretty unpleasant character. I mean, let's not forget, this is the guy who literally proved to be too out there for GB News after the pretty disgusting comments that he made, which I'm not even going to repeat, about a young female journalist, which he found himself expelled from the channel for. I think there is a wider issue around this, which I don't think gets enough airtime, which is that when I hear about this, the thing that it makes me reflect on is the position of libel laws in this country and laws around defamation. And as a journalist, and again, most people, understandably, never ever come into contact with this, I am acutely aware of just how strict and how difficult libel laws and our defamation laws, which are some of the strictest in Europe and in the West more generally, can be. Not in this case, this isn't about suppressing journalism, but, I've worked on stories where you just get a load of emails. I'm thinking about stories I've done on, say, business dealings in this country, foreign business dealings, and you get these avalanche of emails from some of London's top city firms or law firms, basically threatening you, saying, if you say anything about this, this will be a defamation case against you. This will be a libel case against you. And what I worry about this is a issue around principle. Look, in my view, these people who have made this accusation about Mr. Fox, they should be able to say that. In the United States, they would be able to say that under their First Amendment rights. And the point is, which is the sort of crux of this case, the legal case, is it's not like they were saying it out of complete isolation, out of nowhere. If they had accused, I don't know, like a national treasure rather than a national tosser, say like Maggie Smith, for example, or Ian McKellen of being a racist, people would just go, what? That doesn't make any sense. The point is here, they are drawing on, whatever you think about the ins and outs of the particular thing around Black Lives Matter and Sainsbury's, they are drawing on, and this is their case, previous comments that he had made, which they believe equip them to be able to say that you're a racist.
Yeah.
And the fact is that if you're not able to say that, or the idea of his being a racist or not, should not be being litigated through the courts to make an assertion about it or to make a final judgment about it. He should be able to come back at them with argument and reason to prove why he is not.
Okay.
And if he is unable to do so, then maybe that tells him something.
I think that's the crux of it. I'm not sure that many people would go out on a limb to defend Laurence Fox's actions or words particularly. But I do think it raises a really interesting case, which is in the example he has given, which is that a business like Sainsbury's does not have to do performative gestures like Black History Month. There'll be some who think, well, why the hell not? Sainsbury's can. And there'll be lots of people who think, yeah, actually, I know where he's coming from with that. Why do we have to see businesses put a black box to show that they support Black Lives Matters? Why do we have to see everything on Twitter turn into, the right flag for the right month? Performative, business-orientated, sort of gesture politics. And I think he should be able, whatever you think about him as a past, he should be able to say, why is Sainsbury's doing that without being called a racist? And I hear what you're saying about the libel laws. This is not really, I don't think, about whether he's being a journalist and is asking to say things about Russian oligarchs that would stifle freedom of speech. It's not that. It's about whether he is allowed to say, stop performative gestures without being called racist as a result.
Well, maybe, except that the wider point, I think it is kind of about wider issues around defamation and the status of libel laws in the country. Because if you are able to say to someone, you are not allowed to call me a racist, even if it is your honestly held view, and you have evidence to believe, to back up, that this is not come out of isolation, that there is a wider body of a record which might lead you to that view, I think that's pretty chilling, because fundamentally, actually what he said, you could say, that's defamatory. When he called them paedophiles, you can prove whether or not you're a paedophile.
Well, let's not forget Elon Musk had to spend an awful lot of capital and an apology explaining what he meant by that pedo guy in the case with the Thai cave boy rescue. But what I would say, and I think where his case is slightly killed, is that he already called a woman in the Question Time audience in 2019 a racist. So clearly this doesn't stack up against Laurence Fox. If he can call somebody a racist, then they can probably call it back to him. But I don't think we particularly want to live in a world where everyone calls everyone a racist, whatever they do.
But this is what I mean, is that racism is not an objective thing, right? There are elements of kind of objective truth about it, but it's true to say that we as a society, much like sexism or other types of bits of kind of contested politics, it evolves. What we think of as racism evolves. What we think of as sexism evolves, whatever it happens to be. And therefore, what some people will regard as racist will not be that which other people regard as racist. And therefore, to try and prosecute that through the courts is deeply problematic, because its process itself is part of us as a society, as a democracy, coming to a conclusion about what we think is, or what we think of as racism or not.
I think broadly, he is, that wonderful phrase that our lawyer used, part of the outrage economy. So you probably have to be slightly more cynical and slightly more thoughtful about this and say, whatever happens in this case is good for Laurence Fox. Because if he gets deemed to be a racist, he can go the Farage way and say, see what they've done to me, they've debanked me, they've demortgaged me, they've decareered me, and all because I stood up for the rights of people not to go to Sainsbury's. I could have been Batman. I think, given his track record and everything we know about him, nobody's expecting the judge to turn around and go, actually, he is the Pope, right? That's probably not going to happen at the end of this. But I still think it raises a question about whether you can fight the name calling on Twitter. I think it's quite an interesting case.
There are two things that I would say that there's an element where he might have some right on his side or some credibility. One, I actually agree with you about the performative nature of some of the kind of corporate culture around some of these things. I think it's pretty facile. I don't think it achieves very much. I think often it can come in place of actual serious structural action on behalf of these companies to do things about some of the issues.
That's not what he's saying we should point
I know
out.
that's what I'm saying. I agree with you rather than I agree with him. But yeah, that's the one thing. And I also think it's true to say that I suspect, and this is where arguments around cancel culture do have some, and I don't like the phrase, but the things that denotes have some legitimacy and we should think about, is that I suspect of all the professions, and it is true of most of the professions, but I would imagine in terms of acting, the drama world and so on, theatre world, probably the kind of parameters of opinion that you are permitted to hold and remain respectable, let's put it that way, is probably pretty narrow.
Well,
and
I'm
in some
sure-
cases, getting narrower.
I'm
That
sure
said,
he was invited on to Question Time precisely because he
Yes.
was an actor with right-wing views.
Indeed.
Or an actor who wasn't sort of part of the liberal lovey saying.
Indeed, and I think you can make an argument to say, not just in the drama world, but in others as well, that those parameters ought to be broader. We ought to be a bit more tolerant of a wider range of political views, and that shouldn't mean you don't get work in X, Y, or Z. But I think whatever and however wide those parameters were, I suspect Fox would always have fallen outside of them. And as you have already alluded to, Emily, he probably always wanted to.
Well, it was those YouTube videos. I mean, what can we say?
Yeah, I try and avoid YouTube wherever possible, of course.
We are all agog.
Are we?
Yes, we're all ears agog. We are waiting to find out who our special guest is. We're listening out for the little tinkle of sleigh bells, but we think it might be less Christmassy and slightly more sunny.
It's John. It's 6:30 in the morning, and I've just woken up to a message. Could I record something? Bloody right I can. I listened to the introduction yesterday where you seemed to find it a source of enormous mirth that I was in the Caribbean, maybe on holiday. I don't have a holiday every other week, as Lewis always exaggerates. It's an occasional well-deserved rest. Anyway, just to say, missing you loads. It's tough out here, tough with the mojitos and the rum punches, wonderful music, the sea lapping gently. But I'll be on the US edition today because there is so much to discuss. Liz Truss and Donald Trump. What a match made in heaven that is. We'll be discussing it on Newsagents USA.
I mean, look, spare a thought for Linda, John's wife, who has to take the man on holiday and then lie next to a man who's up at 6:30 already recording a trail for a programme that he's going to do a little bit later in the day.
Bored already.
That must be fun.
And also, by the way, this thing about... He is right, to be fair, John. He is right. He does not take a holiday every other week. It's every other month. So that is... I'm willing to retract... I don't want to
Correction.
defame John Sopel.
To be
I don't
fair,
want to defame
this
him.
has been through the lawyers, the newsagent's lawyers, and
Yes.
we'd now like to make it
A formal
concrete
retraction. I apologise,
apology.
John. I apologise.
Won't see you two in the High Court then.
Yeah, so see you in December, but not January.
Yes.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.